We still find ourselves in this post-Easter season, this time when Jesus' spottings calls things to rise up within us. And today's final sighting from the fourth Gospel of John pushes our envelopes a little further. For those of you who weren't with us 2 weeks ago, we talked about the uprising of belief of doubting Thomas, who learned that faith was the opposite of certainty, and that he needed to embrace mystery and give up his need to know everything. Last week we discussed the uprising of fellowship, where God stretched the Christian tent wide enough to include everyone, regardless of their skin color, their family of origin, their religious tradition, or even their sexuality. Today we learn from the overeager disciple Simon Peter, one of my personal favorites, what discipleship really means and how he must learn to follow in order to lead. Like last week, our story takes place in a liminal space, one of those in-between places. This time it's not between two cities on a wilderness road, but it's between two times of day, between the darkness of night and the bright light of the morning. And during this pre-dawn time, everything is a little fuzzy. Everything is a little gray. I don't know if you're ever up at that time of the morning. I often am. It seems like it's a good time for me to pray and to get started and to get grounded. But perhaps this grayness and this fuzziness is the reason that Jesus' closest friends don't recognize him on the beach, even from a distance of a few hundred yards. This is not just any morning, though. This is a morning filled with frustration and disappointment. This group of men has lost one of their very close friends and their teachers in death. And they know that he's risen again. They've seen him twice, but they're just not sure what to do with this knowledge. And so one of them, one who reminds me of myself at times, because he's the most vocal in the group, he's the first one to jump up and offer a suggestion, usually later to his own embarrassment and chagrin. But Simon Peter jumps up and he suggests that they all go fishing. Now you see, many of these men were professional fishermen before they came to join Christ, and so this was a suggestion that they go back to their roots, that they do something that they know how to do, that they attempt to find solace or meaning in a skill that they possess, in something that feels comfortable. And maybe along the way they could even help out their families a bit financially, the families that they abandoned to go off on this great adventure to follow Jesus. Perhaps some of them were considering going back to this line of work. Maybe they were homesick. Maybe they were even hungry because the early disciples depended on the charity of other Christians and Jesus' followers to take them in. And after the death and resurrection of Christ, there were so many people still hiding in fear. It wasn't very easy, probably, to find a good meal in those days. Have you ever wondered why there's so many fishing stories in the New Testament? Jesus fed the 5,000 with bread and fish. Jesus said the disciples would become fishers of men. Even the fish, ichthus, became the symbol of Jesus' following after his death. When two strangers would meet in the marketplace, they would draw a picture of a fish with their sticks. And if you looked down and saw two fish in the dirt, then you knew you were safe to discuss your faith or your relationship to Jesus Christ. While I was preparing for this sermon, I read a psychological commentary. It's not something I always do. Sometimes it just confuses me and sends me down rabbit holes. But this time, it actually gave me a new perspective that I'd like to share with you about fishing and fishermen. Apparently, fish appear frequently in many people's dreams. Have any of you ever dreamed of fish? Maybe you remember, maybe you don't. But apparently it happens quite commonly, and the fish are symbols of the contents of our unconscious minds. Like fish swimming in the depths of our psyche, these are things which the deepest part of us knows, but which the conscious part of us is not yet ready to understand or recognize. These fish can be caught and lifted up to our consciousness, though, where they can be eaten or integrated into our lives. And when I first read this, I thought, this is just neo-Jungian, navel-gazing, useless knowledge. But the more I prayed about it, I uncovered this. There's also a Greek word called kalcheno, which has a double meaning. The first is to search for the purple fish. Now, back in ancient Greece, there was a mollusk that lived at the very bottom of the sea, and it produced a purple dye, which was used to dye the robes of royalty and the rich, a highly prized dye, this purple dye. But the divers had to dive deep in order to grab that purple fish. The second meaning of the word kalacheno is to search the depths of one's mind, to ponder deeply. And like the divers, we have to dive deep to find our unconscious truths. Many Christian authors since ancient Greece have written about this phenomenon. Most recently, and one of my favorites, was Father Richard Rohr in his book, Falling Upwards. He talks about the way that we have to ride our own demons down in life, to the bottom, to the depths, where it's dark and lonely and scary. If we ever want to find the truth, if we ever want to find Jesus, to find real hope, to find a bedrock for ourselves and our lives. Perhaps Jesus chose fishermen when he was looking for servants among all the other blue-collar and white-collar intellectuals and workers in the region of that time. Perhaps he chose fishermen because they had a reputation for being deep thinkers. They were unafraid of the depths. They knew that they had to mine the darkness for treasure in order to feed their villages. Perhaps grabbing a fishing pole and heading out to the nearest lake or stream isn't lazy, as my grandmother used to suggest every time my grandfather went out fishing. But perhaps this is an ancient way to gather wisdom and strength and to prepare ourselves for what comes next. Back to our story, back to the boat. There's a boat full of professional fishermen, and they've been fishing all night long, the most fruitful time to fish. And yet still, with all their knowledge and all their experience and all their skills, they come up empty. And they're hungry. And they're confused. And they're angry. And they're frustrated. And they're lost. And all of a sudden, they see a do-gooder on the shore, a couple of yards away, shouting out unwanted advice. Hey, buddy, why don't you throw your net on the other side of the boat? I bet their first reaction was, who does that guy think he is? Why should we listen to some crazy dude on the beach? The sun hasn't even come up yet. But you know what? They'd had no luck with their own way. They'd had no luck with their own will, with their own knowledge, with their own skills, with their own wisdom. And so, what the heck? They throw the net on the other side of the boat. And they pull up, the Bible says, 153 fish. This is a pretty exact number for the gospel writer, 153. And so since the beginning of Christianity, for thousands of years, great writers and thinkers have tried to explain 153. And I'm going to tell you just three brief theories. The first is Cyril of Alexander, and he thought 100 meant wholeness and stood for the Gentiles who were being invited into God's fold. 50 stood for the remnant of Jews who were also going to join Jesus Christ, and 3 was the Holy Trinity. Easy, 153, 153. Then there was Jerome, who said there were likely 153 kinds of fish in the Sea of Galilee, and so this number represents the fact that all people from all nations are going to be invited to the love of Jesus Christ. But I will say probably my favorite, because it's the most complicated and obtuse, is Augustine. Now, for those of you who've read Augustine, he was a bit of a mathematician, so stick with me on this one. He said that 10 is the number of the law, 10 commandments, and 7 is the number of grace, the sevenfold gifts of the Spirit. And so 10 plus 7, or 17, equals any way to get to God, through the law or through grace. And if you take the numbers 1 to 17 and you add them up, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and so on, the sum of those numbers is 153. You got it, okay. So Augustine had a lot of time on his hands, right? But what he came up with is that it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, if you follow the law or you follow the grace of Jesus Christ, everyone is invited to the party. Everyone is invited into the net of the Christian church. And in that net, there is more than enough room for all of us. Even with 153 fish stretched to its very last thread, the net held. It didn't break. And our church is big enough to hold all of the different kinds of people that come inside of it, like we discussed last week with the Ethiopian eunuch. And who knows? What's certain is that the number 153 was certainly enough fish to feed an entire village. And what's more certain is that Jesus didn't need those fish to fry for breakfast. If you look at the text, he was already waiting on the beach. He brought his own fish and his own bread, and he was ready to feed his disciples. He invited them to bring their gifts, their fish, to the party to share, but he didn't need them. God doesn't need us. God is doing God's work in this world, with or without us. But we are invited to the party. We are invited to bring our gifts and to join into the fellowship of community. And we're invited into discipleship with Jesus Christ. What does that mean? In the sharing of the meal, Jesus heals some of these men's brokenness and their guilt and their shame. You remember Simon Peter had denied him 3 times around a campfire the day after Jesus was arrested. And perhaps the smell of that early morning fire on the beach brought him back to that other morning where he denied 3 times before the cock crowed. Perhaps he remembered his own shame and his guilt, his eager promises. I would be the last one to forsake you, Jesus, and the first one to give up when the going got tough. Smells often play a strong role in our memories. I remember after the flood, the first time I opened my grandmother's china cabinet, and it still smelled of her home, and I wept. Because no flood, no disaster could take away that bond, that family. And in our lives, we go through a lot of disasters, don't we? The natural kind, the unnatural kind, the kind we cause one another with our intentional or unintentional cruelness and selfishness. And yet, Jesus stands on the shore and he beckons us to come. He offers us forgiveness. And 3 times he asked Simon Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Then feed my sheep. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Then feed my lambs. Do you love me? That 3rd time must have cut so deep. And Peter said, yes, Lord, I love you. And Jesus said, well, what are you going to do about it? It's one thing to say words with our mouths. It's another thing to make choices about how we live our lives. One of my favorite preachers, Tom Wright, wrote this. Here is the secret of all Christian ministry, yours and mine, lay and ordained, full-time and part-time. It's the secret of everything, from being a quiet back row member of a prayer group to being a platform speaker at huge rallies and conferences. If you are going to do any single solitary thing as a follower and servant of Jesus, this is what it's built on. Somewhere, deep down inside, there is a love for Jesus. And though goodness knows you've let him down enough times, he wants to find that love, to give you a chance to express it, to heal the hurts and the failures of the past, and to give you new work to do. You see, Jesus never said, I forgive you. He said something more important. Feed my sheep. I trust you. I entrust my ministry in this world to you. Do what you were created to do. The funny thing is, Simon Peter wasn't the first one to recognize Jesus. It was John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. John, the deep thinker, the philosopher, who saw, who knew, and who said, it's the Master. But it was Simon Peter who jumped out of the boat and raced on shore and left all the hard work to the other guys. You know, Peter is no Paul. He's no great preacher and orator. He doesn't travel all around the world. He doesn't write half of our New Testament. And Peter is no John. He's no quiet, solemn, meditative man who recognizes deep truths before their time. Peter's the activist. He gets up and goes, not always in the right direction, but always with a heart and a love of God. I think that's why I like him so much. Because even when he is at his lowest point, we find Jesus waiting on the shore of Peter's life. And he calls out some pretty good, but at the time pretty unwanted advice about how to carry on. Jesus offers his hand of faith and fellowship and discipleship, and he's waiting to heal and feed us and to give us a job to do today. Not because he needs us to do it, but because we need to do it. So why not accept that invitation and toss our nets deep into God's love and see what kind of fish we come up with? Amen. Would you pray with me?